Said that I would address some of the issues that got us to where we are today. I think a lot of those issues are probably well known to many people here. There are many books out. There's even an Oscar-nominated movie, I understand. But be that as it may, what I would like to do, actually, is to inform you about what is happening in Iraq today. As the director of Iraq programs for the U.S. Institute of Peace, an independent, bipartisan federal institute that's chartered by Congress and only funded by Congress, I maintain an office in Baghdad. I have a staff in Baghdad. I was just in Iraq 3 weeks ago. And we keep our fingers on the pulse of many different parts of Iraq and its people. The two things I'd like to address today in about 15 minutes are the issues of the military security situation in Iraq and the political situation in Iraq, because the two cannot be discussed absent the other. So when you talk about a surge, you need to recall why the president initiated the surge. He said it was to provide political space for the Iraqi government to get its house in order. Has that occurred? I don't know. I have some indications, and I'm going to discuss them with you. But first off, let me just say that the surge as a military element was successful. My Iraqi staff came to me when I was based in Iraq and said, you know, where American soldiers are showing up in Baghdad, the violence is going down. We're not finding dead bodies in the street anymore. There is a real change. But always in the back of the Iraqi mind is, yeah, but how long is this change going to last? How long are you going to stay? You see, in August of 2006, we said we were going to do this under General Casey, only we would go out, do the operations during daylight, and then return back to base again, not staying with the people. And one of the cardinal rules of counterinsurgencies is to protect the people. They are what the insurgency is all about. So when General Petraeus began to put his forces permanently outside the big bases, living in the neighborhoods, having a 24/7 presence, that made a big difference. The regional situation remains extremely dangerous right now because we are not talking to Iran and Syria. We are not doing the things necessary to try and tamp down the possible storms that could arise within the region. The U.S. election cycle is playing a big role in Iraq and how it's viewing its security situation. Believe me, Iraqis know what's happening in November here in the United States, and they are very concerned. They have their reasons for concern, but we also have ours. American national interests in the region. Interests that have not been fully discussed. At least they weren't fully discussed until the Iraq Study Group defined what the interests were and put them out there for you, the American people, to see and read and debate. Just to quickly go over it, the interests of the United States to prevent Iraq from becoming a haven or a platform for international terrorism, to restore U.S. credibility around the world and its prestige to act independently, to improve regional stability, to limit or redirect Iranian influence, and to maintain Iraq as an independent state. This administration has decided for many years now to use the military as its principal form of power in the region, to the regret of our diplomats and others. My personal view is until we start to bring our diplomacy into play and bring our economists into play and start working both our diplomatic and economic forms of power, the military is going to be mired in Iraq for many, many years. That's the state of the military situation. And as I said, you can't talk about the military without talking about the political situation. Iraq's politics have long been characterized as stalemated, sectarian, and divided by ethnic groups. But today, after a recent visit that some of my colleagues made to Baghdad, where they interviewed many Iraqi politicians and Iraqis in the street, we're seeing signs of increased fluidity in Iraq and its political landscape. The players in Iraq realize this new political reality under this constitution, flawed as it is here to stay. And they are learning now that they have got to work within the process defined by that Constitution. They have to learn to try negotiations with one another. As a result, there is more political space and movement now within Iraqi politics. The grand ethnic and sectarian coalitions, such as the Kurdish and Shia coalition that put the present Maliki government into power, is now fraying. The thought that there is a monolithic Shia bloc in Iraq is now dashed. It's coming apart. And we're now finding that the Sunni are beginning to participate. And they are forming alliances with the Kurds on some issues, with the Shia on other issues. And all three parties, all three blocs are basically doing the same thing. And ladies and gentlemen, what this means is that the Iraqi politicians are getting away from identity-based politics. They are moving towards issues-based politics, which is essential for a functioning democracy. This is good news, but there is a lot that must be learned. There's still a lack of trust, and there are reciprocal suspicions among all parties that exist. But the recent passing of the bundled laws, the laws that concern the Provincial Powers Law, which had been vetoed, and then yesterday the veto was lifted, so it's going to become law now, the amnesty law, and the national budget. The bundling of those three laws was a technique devised by the Iraqis. One group likes one of the laws. Another group hates that particular law and hates the other one too because he only has one law. And so together, all three factions basically held their noses and voted in support of the bundled laws so that they could get the one law that they really want. The Kurds wanted the budget passed. The Sunnis wanted the amnesty law passed. And the Shia wanted the Provincial Powers Law passed. So together, by bundling it, the parliament actually took a step forward. But let's make no mistake about what's really driving the train today in Iraq. Power is what this is all about. Who has power in this country? There are a lot of issues that arise that create the political difficulties of Iraq. You know, some of the key questions that they have is how should power be distributed among the various blocs? How strong should the central government be? How strong should the regions or the provinces of Iraq be? A basic question, is Iraq an Arab state? And you're going to hear from someone who represents a large portion of Iraq that's not Arab. So when the Constitution starts off saying Iraq is an Arab state, what's that really mean? And what is Iraq's proper relationship with its numerical minorities and with the rest of the region? There are constitutional issues that still infect many pieces of legislation. Things such as the IDPs, the internally displaced people and the refugees, and how that will be handled so that it's not a politically sensitive issue. How about the internal boundaries, the boundaries that will define the autonomous region of Kurdistan with the rest of Iraq, and any other regions that are chosen to be formed. Interestingly enough, as we here in America watch their parliament work, and we think we see progress, suddenly the progress can stop for a reason that is known to no one. And when that happens, we here in America get frustrated because we as Americans are very impatient people. We want to tackle problems, we want to overcome them. That's not how Iraq works. That's not how the Middle East works. In fact, when we would discuss the notion of U.S. congressional benchmarks with the Iraqis, they would just chuckle at us and say, those are your priorities, they're not our priorities. So America really needs to take a deep breath and understand that this is an issue that's going to take a lot of time to resolve. Their priorities concern things like the return of the displaced people and refugees, finding jobs for tribal members who are participating in the awakening movement in Iraq, the delivery of services and economic development, and the holding of provincial elections, which are now scheduled for the 1st of October. They are also developing mechanisms within their executive branch by which they can try and ease the passage of laws going through the parliament. But it's a very difficult process that they're pulling together, and as I said before, it can stop on a heartbeat because nobody really understands why. It just stops. We're seeing the new political alignments, as I had described earlier. But one of the things that we found very interesting, at least for the American audience, is that the Iraqis, while they don't want to have foreign occupation, are even less desirous of having an immediate withdrawal of American forces. They see their development and what's happened on the ground in terms of security and their political activities as something that only the presence of American forces could ensure. The Minister of Defense spoke with me a few weeks ago and said it will be 2012 before his military can assume the responsibilities for the internal security of Iraq. And it would be 2018 before his military can assume the responsibilities to defend Iraq from external aggression. They do want a time horizon. They do want to know when we're leaving. But they don't want us to leave quickly. And as King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia told us, he said, "You came in uninvited, don't leave uninvited." So with that, I'm going to stop now, pass the baton on to the next speaker, and I look forward to your questions during the dialogue section. Thank you very much.
And his staff for organizing this event. I must say it's awfully ecumenical of John to invite somebody from the University of Florida to speak to you today. And I must say I admire his ability to draw a crowd. I don't think we could get this many people in Gainesville to come to an event like this, but I think that's probably a reflection of, the quality of the programs that John and his office puts on. Let me, if I try and do one thing and accomplish it, let me try to be brief. It's kind of hard to figure out how to frame my remarks, given that we're now 5 years of experience in Iraq, and there's lots of dimensions to the problem. But let me frame it in the following manner. President Hitt said that we won't resolve the war today. I think that's a safe bet. The other thing we won't resolve are many of the historical debates that are going to be with us for years to come. And you will be reading about these. As Paul pointed out, there have been a lot of books already written. In fact, Tom Friedman said in one of his columns that Barnes & Noble was going to have to open a special section in its basement just to contain all the books about the failure in Iraq. We haven't exhausted the books or the articles or the papers or the opinions, and I think the debate will continue for some time, the debate about why we got into Iraq, the debate about how the decisions were made, the debate about the cost of the war, and the debate about the implications, the results, the future of the war. If I could touch on all four of those very briefly, why we got into Iraq. There are those who think or argue it was about weapons of mass destruction, and of course we all know now that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We also know that it had nothing to do with 9/11 and that Al-Qaeda in Iraq didn't exist before we invaded Iraq, that there were no significant links to Al-Qaeda either, yet we keep hearing this over and over, repeated again, and put together all of these various factors in juxtaposition in various speeches as a way to somehow justify the war. That's one argument. Another is it's all about oil. Well, if it's about access to oil, we bought Saddam Hussein's oil before or when he was in power without any problem. Now with oil trading at somewhere between $105 and $110 a barrel, record highs, it's not perhaps about access to oil. Maybe it's about profits for oil companies, in which case the mission has been accomplished. But I don't believe it's about oil. I also don't think it's about President Bush wanting to show up his father and finish the job, that sort of thing. Vice President Cheney said recently that he considered Iraq a successful endeavor. He also, when it was pointed out that 2/3 of the American people thought that thought the war was a mistake and we should leave, his response was, so? There is, of course, something to be said for not being driven by public opinion polls, but there's also something to be said for informing the American public and listening to their reaction. But as I said, Vice President Cheney thinks it was a successful endeavor. I think, in a sense, it was. In a sense, the mission was accomplished because, for my money, the war in Iraq was about getting reelected and preserving Mr. Bush and Mr. Cheney in power. And the way to do that was the other part of the war that I think was successful, and that is keeping a large portion of the American electorate sufficiently in fear that their brains have been effectively paralyzed. I think we had a recent example of that about 10 days ago on a Saturday. It was probably done on a Saturday because nobody reads newspapers on Saturday or listens to the media. President Bush vetoed a bill that would have restricted the CIA to using the interrogation techniques that are defined in the Army Field Manual. And as someone who represented my country for 28 years in a number of different countries abroad, I really find it pretty repugnant that American diplomats have to go out now and represent a country that embraces torture, that uses it as one of its techniques, and uses it when any trained interrogator will tell you that torture is an ineffective way to gather information. As the Army Field Manual itself points out, you get lousy information, you have adverse reactions not only among the people you torture, but the other people that are influenced by the fact that you are torturing. And in fact, I can think of no better recruiting poster for future terrorists that Al-Qaeda recruiting sergeants are trying to enlist than to hang up a picture of Uncle Sam with the caption, "Uncle Sam wants to torture you." So I don't think the war has made us safer. And the national intelligence estimates, there have been a couple that also agree with that. And so I think the idea that it was all about domestic politics has some credibility. How is the decision made? Well, if you ask around, once former Secretary Rumsfeld was asked how the decision to go to war was made, and he had no real answer. He just sort of said, well, it kind of, it happened, like whatever, you know. There was an article a couple days ago, March 17th, by Michael Gordon in the New York Times, a very long article about Jerry Bremer, who is the head of the Provisional Coalition Authority, and his decision to disband the Iraqi army. And it sort of, after this couple thousand word article, the bottom line was that the decision was, if it wasn't Bremer's alone, was made by a very small group of civilians in the Pentagon. One of the things I did in my career was work in Mozambique when we were trying to bring a peacekeeping operation to a successful conclusion, to have Mozambique's first democratic elections. And one of the essential elements was to get the former armies, the army of the people in power and the army of the rebel groups trying to overthrow them, get them encamped, get them disarmed, get them integrated back into society, and get a small number of them into a national army. And at various times, the whole process was threatened by the progress on that front. So anybody who's been in a post-conflict situation, read about it for more than 15 minutes, had any knowledge at all, knows the obvious fact that if you don't get the people with guns off the street and gainfully engaged somehow, they're going to go back to making their living the only way they know how, which is with guns. And so when you disbanded the Iraqi army and then de-Baathicized the government, you created the potential for several 100,000 people to start an insurgency, which is, of course, exactly what happened. But I think, again, the debate about how those decisions will be made will be something that will be discussed for years to come. Another thing will be the cost. There's a recent estimate by a Nobel-winning economist who says it's going to cost $3 trillion before it's all over for this war. As Mort mentioned, the death toll is uncertain. I think at this point you could make the argument that George Bush, by accident, if you will, has been responsible for killing more Iraqi civilians than Saddam Hussein killed on purpose. But we may never know the answer to that. There are estimates that range from 150,000 on the part of the UN. That was, of course, as of June 30th, 2006. So by now, the number must be well over 200,000 to other numbers that exceed 1 million. We know that we are a couple bodies away from 4,000 dead American servicemen in Iraq. One thing that I found kind of disturbing was that there is a growing lack of interest and awareness on the part of the American public. One media survey found that in August of last year, 54% of the American public knew that there were about 3,500 dead Americans as a result of the Iraq War. As of last month, only 28% of Americans knew that we were approaching 4,000. So that we heard the mantra that we were a nation at war. We now seem to be a nation consumed by our complacency, consumed by our concerns about economic recession, and increasingly disengaged in what's happening in Iraq. And I think that's unfortunate, in particular for the future implications. I think the global war on terrorism is going to continue for some time, if you want to call it the global war on terrorism. Terrorism is a tactic. It's not an entity. And how you fight tactics, you have to do it. You can't simply drop bombs on it. You have to be fairly skillful about it. We have Mr. bin Laden out there still thumbing his nose at us. He, of course, released a recording just yesterday. But whether he's killed or not, I think we've created a generation of terrorists that are going to hate America and be looking for ways to harm our interests for years to come. So that's something that's not going to go away. I think the other thing that we have greatly damaged is our ability to achieve any of our objectives. You've heard the term soft power, hard power. Hard power is your ability to force people to do what you want, either through the use of military force or economic sanctions. Soft power is the ability to convince people to do what we want them to do, to convince them that it's their interest to cooperate with us and achieve what America wants to do in a way that will also benefit them. I think this administration has basically made a lot of use of hard power and thought that because we were the world's only superpower, soft power was for sissies and therefore unnecessary. Well, Iraq and Afghanistan have demonstrated the limits of our hard power. Our armed forces are essentially broken, overextended, and we have very limited hard power left. But in the process of using that hard power, we have also diminished our soft power. We have diminished our ability to convince anybody that America should have a leadership role. And I think finally, I would observe that the next president, given that situation, you might wonder why anyone would want the job at this point. An economic recession, America is standing in the world, plumbing new depths, a war in Iraq that's not going to go away. But I hope the next president comes in to office and looks at the world not as a black and white place, not as a place where it's simply a struggle between good and evil, and all that we have to do is identify ourselves as the agents of good and against everything evil. Governing is about taking choices between a lot of not so great options. There's a lot of gray there, a lot of lack of information, and fundamentally it comes down to judgment. So whoever is next as president, I hope will exercise that judgment, and I hope begin to rebuild the America and make it the place that we all aspire it to be, so that it can return to a role of leadership in the world. Thank you for being here.